Let me tell you something that most people get completely wrong about food security. They assume that when we talk about threats to America's food supply, we're talking about crop failures or extreme weather or maybe some distant agricultural crisis in a region that doesn't really matter to daily life. And on the surface, that logic makes total sense. Why wouldn't it? The United States produces more food than almost any country on earth. It exports massive quantities of grain, beef, poultry, dairy. It's one of the world's great agricultural powerhouses. But here's where it gets interesting. And honestly, this realization flipped my entire understanding of how modern food systems actually work. The American food system doesn't run on American resources anymore. It runs on a single input that comes almost entirely from one country. And that country is China. And China just made a decision that changes everything. Before you dismiss this as exaggeration, let me be very specific about what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about food imports. I'm talking about the chemical foundation underneath American agriculture. Fertilizer, specifically phosphate fertilizer. The United States applies roughly 22 million tons of fertilizer to its cropland every year. Without that fertilizer, yields collapse. We're not talking about a 10 or 15% reduction. We're talking about catastrophic decline, the kind that turns breadbasket regions into subsistence farming zones within a single growing season. And here's the part that should genuinely concern anyone paying attention to strategic vulnerabilities. China controls approximately 70% of global phosphate rock reserves. The United States imports nearly 85% of its phosphate from foreign sources. And in the last 18 months, China has systematically restricted phosphate exports, redirected supply chains toward Belt and Road partner nations, and restructured its entire fertilizer export system around strategic allocation rather than market pricing. The conventional framing treats this as a trade issue, a negotiation point, something that gets resolved through diplomatic channels or market adjustment. But that framing misses the actual structure of what's happening. This isn't about economics. It's about the deliberate construction of dependency as a geopolitical weapon. And to understand why that matters so much, you have to think about what fertilizer actually represents in the architecture of modern state power. There's a concept in strategic studies called the choke point resource. It's not the most valuable resource. It's not the resource everyone talks about. It's the resource that, if removed, causes systemic collapse in ways that cannot be quickly substituted or worked around. Oil was the 20th century's defining choke point resource. Control the oil supply, and you control industrial economies, military mobility, and the entire transportation infrastructure that modern societies depend on. Fertilizer is emerging as the 21st century's equivalent choke point for food systems. And China recognized this decades before Western policymakers even began paying attention. Let me walk you through exactly how this system evolved, because the architecture is actually a deliberate multi-decade strategy running in 3 overlapping phases. Phase 1 was resource consolidation. Through the 1990s and early 2000s, China invested heavily in securing phosphate reserves, not just domestically, but through strategic partnerships and acquisitions across Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia. The stated purpose was ensuring Chinese food security. And that was true. But it was never only about Chinese needs. It was about achieving market dominance in a resource that every industrialized agricultural system requires but few countries possess in meaningful quantities. Phase 2 was infrastructure development and export capacity building. By the 2010s, China had constructed the world's most advanced fertilizer production and logistics network. It could produce phosphate fertilizer at scale with cost efficiency no competitor could match and deliver it globally through ports and shipping relationships that created dependency. Countries that might have developed domestic alternatives found it cheaper and easier to simply import from China, the United States included. American phosphate mining declined steadily as Chinese imports increased. The economic logic was sound. Why maintain expensive domestic production when you can import the same product cheaper? But economic logic and strategic logic operate on entirely different time horizons. Phase 3 is what we're watching unfold right now, and this is where it gets genuinely complicated. China isn't cutting off fertilizer exports entirely. That would trigger immediate retaliation, stockpiling, and frantic efforts to rebuild domestic production capacity. Instead, China is implementing what it calls export optimization. It means fertilizer exports now flow preferentially to countries participating in Belt and Road infrastructure projects, countries that have aligned their foreign policy positions with Chinese interests, and countries that provide strategic value to Beijing's broader geopolitical objectives. The allocation system isn't transparent. There's no published formula, but the pattern is absolutely clear. Countries that challenge Chinese territorial claims in the South China Sea see fertilizer shipments delayed or reduced. Countries that vote with China in international forums see reliable supply and favorable pricing. Now, layer on top of that something that makes this particularly significant. The United States cannot simply decide to restart phosphate mining and processing at scale. The infrastructure doesn't exist anymore. The mines that closed over the past 30 years don't just reopen with the flip of a switch. You're looking at a minimum 5 to 7 year timeline to rebuild domestic phosphate production capacity that could meet even 50% of current demand. And that assumes immediate political will, regulatory fast-tracking, massive capital investment, and no environmental opposition. None of those assumptions are safe bets. Here's the second thing to understand. The fertilizer dependency isn't just about volume, it's about timing. Fertilizer application operates on a precise agricultural calendar. You apply phosphate at specific points in the growing season. Miss that window, and the crop yield suffers regardless of how much fertilizer you apply later. This creates a strategic vulnerability that has no real buffer. Oil you can stockpile. You can maintain strategic reserves that provide months or even years of runway if supply disruptions occur. Fertilizer doesn't work that way. It degrades in storage, it requires specific handling, and the quantities needed are so massive that stockpiling enough to weather a multi-year supply disruption would require storage infrastructure that simply doesn't exist. Think about what happens when a system this fundamental faces disruption, even partial disruption. Let's say China doesn't cut off fertilizer entirely. Let's say it just reduces exports to the United States by 30%. That's not catastrophic in isolation, but it's enough to force immediate triage decisions. Which crops get fertilizer priority, which regions, which producers. You've just introduced allocation politics into American agriculture. And once you're allocating scarce inputs through political mechanisms rather than market mechanisms, you've fundamentally transformed how the food system operates. Prices spike, farmers hoard, speculators enter the market. The government faces pressure to intervene, and each intervention creates new distortions that compound the original problem. Now add to this something that makes the fertilizer situation particularly unsettling to strategic planners in Washington. This vulnerability exists in a sector that Americans assume is completely secure. Food security doesn't show up in the same threat assessments as energy security or military supply chains. The assumption has always been that America feeds itself, exports the surplus, and never faces real scarcity. That assumption is wrong, but it's a politically powerful assumption. It means there's no constituency demanding action, no pressure to rebuild domestic fertilizer production, no sense of urgency about a dependency that leaves the entire agricultural system exposed to decisions made in Beijing. Let me show you the historical parallel that helps clarify why this pattern should feel familiar. In the years leading up to World War I, Britain had achieved something remarkable. It dominated global trade networks, controlled the world's reserve currency, and maintained naval supremacy that protected its supply lines. But Britain had also made a strategic choice. It allowed its domestic food production to decline in favor of importing cheap grain from the Americas, Argentina, and Russia. The economic logic was impeccable. Why grow wheat in Britain when you can import it cheaper from more productive regions? But when war broke out, those supply lines became targets. German submarines didn't need to invade Britain. They just needed to sink enough merchant ships to disrupt food imports. By 1917, Britain was weeks away from starvation. The dependency that made perfect economic sense in peacetime became a strategic catastrophe in crisis. The United States is replicating that exact pattern with fertilizer. The dependency makes economic sense right up until the moment it becomes a weapon. And China is not subtle about the fact that it views resource control as a form of leverage. Chinese strategic documents explicitly discuss strategic strategic resource dominance as a pillar of comprehensive national power. Fertilizer appears in those frameworks alongside rare earth elements, advanced semiconductors, and other inputs where China has achieved market dominance through deliberate long-term investment. But here's where it clicks, and this is what most coverage misses entirely. The fertilizer dependency isn't operating in isolation. It's one component of a broader strategic architecture where China has systematically positioned itself as the indispensable supplier of inputs that industrialized economies cannot quickly replace. Rare earth elements for electronics and defense systems, active pharmaceutical ingredients for medications, solar panel components for renewable energy transitions, battery materials for electric vehicles, and now agricultural inputs for food production. Each dependency individually might seem manageable, but together they create a network of vulnerabilities where disruption in one area compounds pressure in others. Project this forward, and what you see is not a single moment of crisis, but a gradual shift in the leverage dynamics that structure international politics. The United States built its post-World War II order on the assumption that economic interdependence creates mutual vulnerability. You depend on us, we depend on you. And that mutual dependency reduces the incentive for conflict. But that logic assumes rough symmetry in the dependencies. When one country controls the choke point resources and the other country depends on them, interdependence doesn't reduce conflict risk. It creates leverage that the controlling power can activate whenever strategic interests align. Think about what this means for American foreign policy flexibility. Every time the United States considers a position that conflicts with Chinese interests, there's now a calculation about fertilizer supply. Not explicitly, not in the formal policy process, but implicitly in the background awareness that agriculture depends on inputs that China controls. That's how dependencies function in geopolitical competition. They don't create hard constraints. They create soft pressure that nudges decision-making in directions that avoid triggering the dependency weapon. And the genius of this approach is that it operates almost invisibly. There's no dramatic confrontation, no ultimatum, just a quiet understanding that certain policy positions carry agricultural consequences. Now let's trace how this dynamic moves from agricultural vulnerability to regional power shifts. The United States has maintained alliances across Asia-Pacific, partly through the implicit promise of food security. Countries like Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan import massive quantities of American agricultural products. They depend on those imports for food security. That dependency has historically reinforced their strategic alignment with Washington. But if American food production becomes vulnerable to Chinese fertilizer control, that entire relationship structure starts to wobble. Why align with a country whose own food security depends on the goodwill of your largest neighbor and most significant economic partner? The dependency chains start running in the wrong direction for American strategic interests. At the global level, the implications cascade further. The international system has operated on the assumption that the United States can use its agricultural surplus as strategic tool. Food aid, preferential trade access, agricultural development assistance, these have all functioned as instruments of American influence. But if the foundation of American agricultural productivity rests on Chinese fertilizer exports, that entire toolkit becomes contingent rather than assured. Countries receiving American food assistance or agricultural support understand that the United States itself operates under dependency. That knowledge reduces the geopolitical value of the assistance. Then there's the economic dimension that deserves serious attention. The United States runs a persistent trade deficit with China. Agricultural exports have been one of the few sectors where trade flows in the other direction. American farmers export soybeans, corn, wheat, and other commodities to China in quantities that partially offset the manufacturing imports running the other way. But those agricultural exports depend on fertilizer inputs. If China restricts phosphate exports, American agricultural productivity declines, export volumes fall, and the trade imbalance worsens. It's a feedback loop where the dependency creates vulnerability that damages the economic relationship that the dependency supposedly supported. At the deepest structural level, what we're watching is the erosion of a fundamental assumption about how American power operates. The assumption has always been that America possesses strategic depth, that even if individual supply chains or relationships face disruption, the underlying resource base, technological innovation capacity, and economic scale provide resilience. The fertilizer dependency reveals that assumption is increasingly wrong. Strategic depth requires control or reliable access to the inputs that critical systems depend on. When those inputs come from a strategic competitor who explicitly views resource control as geopolitical leverage, strategic depth evaporates. You're operating on someone else's sufferance, and sufferance can be withdrawn whenever interests diverge. The conditions that would make fertilizer supply disruption likely are not hypothetical. They're assembling in real time. Taiwan remains the single most probable flashpoint for US-China military confrontation. If that crisis escalates to sanctions, blockades, or conflict, does anyone seriously believe China continues reliable fertilizer exports to the United States? The scenario isn't far-fetched. It's the logical extension of a dependency that places critical agricultural inputs in the hands of a country with whom relations are deteriorating across multiple dimensions simultaneously. So when you zoom all the way out and look at the complete picture, what you see is not a simple trade relationship or a supply chain that can be easily restructured. What you see is a very deliberate trap, a trap built not through active manipulation, but through patient exploitation of the economic logic that led American policymakers to allow domestic fertilizer production to decline while dependency on Chinese exports increased. The trap works because it was never forced. Every step made economic sense. Every individual decision was rational. But the accumulated effect is strategic vulnerability that has no quick fix and no easy substitute. The real question is not whether the United States can rebuild domestic fertilizer production capacity. The question is whether it can do so before the dependency becomes a weapon that gets activated in a crisis that American strategic planners might not even see coming. Because China isn't signaling its intentions loudly. It's just quietly restructuring export allocation systems, prioritizing belt and road partners, and making sure that the countries most likely to challenge Chinese interests understand that food security is not guaranteed anymore. Empires do not fall because they lack resources. They fall because they allow critical resources to become dependencies that seem manageable right up until they're not. And right now, every time an American farmer applies fertilizer to a field in Iowa or Kansas or Nebraska, that farmer is depending on decisions made in Beijing about who gets supply priority and who doesn't. That's not food security. That's structural vulnerability masquerading as normal market function. And the conditions that would expose that vulnerability are assembling with remarkable speed.